Hi, my name is Asif Khan and I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. In today's session, we will be discussing about Microsoft Graph API. So Microsoft Graph API is a very broad ecosystem of APIs which are basically helping end users to access different resources or different products suite from the Microsoft product ecosystem. So let's say if you are dealing with Microsoft 365 products, or if you're having Windows 10 or enterprise mobility or Microsoft security ecosystem, you would like to get resources, want to get details through the APIs. And at this stage, there are different models how you can access resources from each of these different ecosystems. Now, the challenge, what the Microsoft product team looked at was, can we unify this entire experience and have a one-stop shop for accessing all the underlying resources which might be sitting in 365 or Windows 10 or maybe let's say enterprise mobility or security? Can we have that one level of abstraction of APIs and then the user just talk to those APIs and those APIs will make the magic of getting the details from the underlying systems. So that's where the Microsoft Graph is more like a gateway to the data and integration in the Microsoft ecosystem. And it can be used by developers, it can be used by administrators, it can be used by security teams, and it can be used on a very wide range of different capabilities which you can build on top of Graph APIs. And fundamentally, it's also used by the Microsoft product ecosystem as well internally for building a lot of different capabilities. So so if you look at the Microsoft Graph on a very high level, it's a very simple abstraction on top of the underlying Microsoft product ecosystem, which obviously I talked about the different product ecosystem we have. Now, if we look at literally how exactly that magic happens is if you look at my second image, that's where we are talking about how the Graph API work. And if you look at it, it's the most simplified experience a user can get. The level of products which we talked about 365 and Windows 10, enterprise mobility, security, all that are like pretty diverse ecosystems. Now, if you look at, there are only four steps which you need to do in order to get access to any product within those ecosystems. So the first stage is where you have to verify as a user that you are a valid authorized user who should get access to the relevant resources which you're trying to access in the downstream. Now, first is we need to have an identity system where we will be identifying your identity, and that's where we have Azure AD tenant. So Microsoft Identity Platform will basically be your Azure AD, which would be having your application registrations and stuff like that, so that when the request comes in, we have that identity system awareness and it will reply back with the acknowledge token. Now, the acknowledgement token will have a lot of different claims and details, but fundamentally it has some of the things like what are the different scopes which you have access to. And I'll show you all of that when we will be going forward in our demo and presentation. Now, if you look at that, once you get the token, the next step is as simple as just make a request for the relevant resource you're trying to access. So whether you're trying to access a OneDrive or an Outlook email, or let's say a Teams channel, or let's say a OneNote, OneDrive, OneNote document, or let's say any other resources, let's say from the security, you want to get telemetries and whatnot. So that would be your request, and each of those have their own dedicated endpoint. Now, once you provide the request along with the token, and which is a valid token, Microsoft Graph will validate that token against the identity platform. And if the token is valid, it will go down into the downstream products and it will try to get the details and reply back in an HTTP response format. So if I switch gears and if I show you how that those API ecosystem look like. So if you look at the Microsoft documentation. So this is the Microsoft docs for Microsoft Graph REST APIs. Obviously, it has a wide range of different APIs, and I'll quickly show you some of those. So if you look at the user side of things, it is more about your Azure AD tenant and user aspects. So you can get all the users. So as we were talking about, once you get the token, you make a request. You can make a request to the user endpoint, which is in this case as simple as /user. Now the base URL, if you look at the base URL, it's just the same base URL used for all the different APIs. So you use the base URL and then you provide your version, which would be 1.0 or 2.0, and then you can have your specific endpoint which you are trying to access. If you pass this request with a valid token, you'll get a very valid response. And you can see you can do a lot of things. You can create user, you can get user, you can update user, so and even change password. So if you want to automate that because your BAU process is overcomplicated about making a support request through a ticketing system and then a password is reset, I think this magic can make your life easy by just building a self-service in on top of these APIs. Now, if you look at the other things, you can even access the entire Azure AD directory objects. You can access contacts, calendars, mails, photos, people, notes. So yeah, it covers mostly the entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And then pushing the envelope further, you can also have identity and access related details where you can have your directory management stuff. Obviously, there are security related details where you can get security score. So this security score is more about the security score of your tenant, and obviously likes of those things. So a lot of different APIs are available for all the three different major ecosystem I talked about: the Microsoft 365, the enterprise mobility, security, and Windows 10. So if you look at the literal capability, there is an invitation management, and I'll just try to quickly explain how this entire API real estate can help you in building something very relevant. So if you look at this, this is an invitation resource type, which is if you would have already used Azure AD, one of the capability in Azure AD is where you can make a B2B request. So what that means is, let's say your user exists in an Active Directory A, and you want to have the same user in Active Directory B. One of the options is to go and create him again, and that will have a separate entire user access management and user password management system. Now, the other bit is I can just take my current user from my Active Directory A and then create a particular federation sort of thing in my Active Directory 2. And that would basically lead that the user will be available for all the RBACs and whatnot, but all the management will be done on the primary Active Directory. Now, in this case, you can do all that through the APIs. So you can get the user using the user APIs, and then you can target that user to be created in the second Active Directory through an invitation process, and that all can be done through an API ecosystem. So it makes pretty easy the entire experience side of things. Now, switching gears and coming back to our ecosystem of Azure Graph APIs, Microsoft Graph APIs. So as you can see, there are different ways how you can access it. So you can use the HTTP-based endpoint model. So make a HTTP request, get a token, and then make a request to the relevant resources. There are also like the SDKs available for Graph APIs, and for the identity side of things, you can use MSAL. So MSAL is basically Microsoft Authentication Library, and it is used for not only Graph, but in a wider sense. If you are dealing with Azure Active Directory, you can use MSAL for a lot of different purposes. So as you can see on the left side, we have different ecosystems of application stacks, whether you're using you're using an AngularJS application, whether it's a SPA, or you're using a Blazor, or you're using ASP.NET Core, or Java application, or Python, or Ruby. Obviously, all that are well supported with MSAL libraries, and MSAL libraries are available natively for each of these environments. So you can use that. That would make your entire experience of getting a token and token refresh and all that stuff much easy with the Azure Active Directory for your application. So because it's an SPA, so it also supports all the JavaScript related frameworks which are available in the market. And once you have the token, next is you basically create a Microsoft Graph request to get the Graph API details, whichever you are after. So as I was talking about that you will need relevant accesses on the relevant downstream products which you want to access using the Microsoft Graph API. So that's where I would like to switch gears and show you a little bit about the access capabilities. So this is again the Microsoft documentation, which has a very detailed specifications around the access level. So if you look at here, this is just an example for the user, which is the Azure AD user. So based on whatever you're trying to do, you will have to provide different access level, the delegation permissions on top of your app registration. Now, again, the app registration, I'll just show you in a tick how that experience look like. But yeah, as you can see, there is a user read permission and read write permission. You can have an invitation permission again, as I was talking about the invite, which is creating a B2B request. There are different application permissions. So fundamentally, there are two different type of permissions. You can have a delegated permissions or you can have an application permission. So based on how you're trying to access the Microsoft Graph API resources, you will have to make a decision whether it's application model or you're trying to do something like a daemon job or in a background job. So on the left side, right side, you can see there is a wide list of different access permissions. So let's say if you're doing using the Graph API for accessing the search, Microsoft Bing search, or let's say you're trying to access your mails, so you can have mail read, write, and mailbox settings. Or if you're trying to access things like your drives, so you would need the drive read or write sort of permission. So it's pretty straightforward, but yeah, you would need all these delegation or application permission. Now, where exactly these elements are configured, that is important to see. So what I'll do is I'll quickly show you on the Azure portal itself. So this is one of my app registration which I have done. Now what an app registration is, if I click on the Azure Active Directory, so inside the Azure Active Directory, you can see I have a specific app registration option. So if I click on that, what that leads to is it leads to all the application which I have registered. Now this application registration is important because if we switch back to our diagram, so over here this Microsoft Identity Platform, when you make a request, it would need some app registration over here which would help the Microsoft Identity Platform, which is Azure AD, to know that, okay, this particular consumer needs access to the token for a specific application registration, because inside the application registration you have a lot of configuration details. Now those configuration details are, one of those configuration detail are that access permissions. The other is like if you want to have a callback URL, so that's another configuration which you do inside your Azure AD app registration. So coming back to our Azure AD app registration, this is the app registration I have. I'll show you how that workflow works. It's very straightforward and simple. But if you look at it, I've got a couple of things. So it tells me what tenant I am in. So this is my current tenant. It gives me things like the client ID, which is more about the client registration ID, this app registration ID. Now, this is the core because this helps when we go back again to our whiteboard. So when the user consumer makes a request, the client ID which we have provided goes as a part of the acquiring token request. And that's where the identity system gets to know that where should I go and find this particular request validation and like the scopes or the access permissions which should be given back if the request or the authorization process is successful. So this client ID is core to that, and I'll show you in the code as well how that is configured. Now, going into the permission side, which we were looking at, so correlating back to this permissions which we were talking about. So over here, as you can see, I have a different set of permissions which I have already given. Now, this is where you define that what permissions you want to give. So if you look at it, once I click that add permission, it gives me all the different services available which you can use from the Microsoft ecosystem. But for the we are referring to Graph API. Again, as I said, there are two different types. You can have a delegated permission. Now, as you can see, it says your application need to access the API as a sign-in user. So that's where you provide the delegation. So it will basically give you a pop-up and you will select your particular user, put the credentials, and that will give you the access. Application permission is more about your application run as a background, so something like a daemon job or stuff like that. So over here, let's just select a delegation, and that's where you will see a long list of different access permissions which are available. So let's say you want to have chat permissions, then you can have your directory permissions. So you can have device permissions, you can have your contacts permissions, and obviously the list goes on and on. And then you can also have your file permission, the OneDrives and whatnot. So yeah, you have to provide those permissions over here, because once you provide those permissions, that's when the request comes in from the consumer side. The particular Active Directory identity platform system will validate the request, verifying the identity, and then provide back in the claim what are the different permissions you have, so that when you take that token back and again make a request to the Graph API. So just quickly correlating that. So when the token comes back, it comes back with all the permissions I have been just showing you. And when you make a request, that will be a part of the token. So those permissions will go with that request, and then the Graph API will check that, okay, if you are asking for a OneDrive file resource, do you have an access token with a permission of that? If you don't, then yeah, it will invalidate the request itself. So that is why permissions are really crucial to be selected. The right permissions should be there, otherwise the system won't work or the APIs won't respond back. So once you have done the API permissions, I think that's pretty much it. There are a couple of other things, which is like the authentication options. So as you can see, you can provide a redirect URL. So once the validation is done or successful, it will reply back to this URL. And then also there are two different options where you can have a token based access token, or you can have an ID token. So obviously these are both like used for implicit flows, and this is used for implicit as well as hybrid flows. So ideally, I was reading the documentation, it says you should use ID token, but yeah, I'm just for the demo purposes, I'm using access token over here. So yeah, once you have done that, that's it. It's pretty straightforward configuring an doing an application registration in Azure AD, and just coming back, if you want to see from the starting how that looks like, you just provide an application registration details, and then you select that where exactly the user will be existing, which will try to authenticate it against the directory, and then you provide a redirect URL, and that's it. Once you register that, you'll get the similar sort of experience. And then over here, you can come and do your app API permissions. And then even if you want to create a security token, that's what you can do as well. So you can create a security token. In some cases, you can use your client ID security token and tenant ID to even access against the Azure AD, and then you can get a token back. So now once we have done this, the next step is like we have the app registration done. We have provided the relevant API permissions. Now the third step is obviously we should go and make a request through a consumer side of things. So for that, we will just get into the code side of the how the implementation is done. On the demo side, I would like to show you how you can access the Graph APIs in three different models. Now, one of the model is where we will be using Visual Studio. And obviously in the sample side, I have four different type of samples. So first sample is, let's say, if you want to access the Graph APIs using Azure Function, which is more like a backend API ecosystem. Second is obviously I'll show you using a console, but over here the difference is instead of using the HTTP based model, which I was talking to you since the beginning of this call discussion, I would say in the second sample we are going to cover it more through the experience of a MSAL, which is Microsoft Authentication Library. If you remember in the whiteboard, I did show you how there are different libraries available for each of those different frameworks, whether it's a SPA or it's a .NET Core or it's a Java or a Spring. So we will look at the MSAL and also the Graph SDK. Now, that will be more in the Visual Studio ecosystem. The other one is around uh, the Postman. So we'll see some Graph API experience from the Postman itself. I'll try to use it for getting the users as well as for OneDrive file access. And on the third experience side of things, I was also planning to show you the same Graph API access using a Logic Apps. So if you're not familiar with Logic Apps is a low-code, no-code ecosystem from Microsoft Azure. And what you can do is instead of like without writing a single line of code compared to what I'll show you in this Visual Studio side of things where we have a lot of code, over here you don't need to write code because under the hood all that is done by Microsoft, and you have GUIs where you can just set up the configuration stuff, and then yeah, the GUI will be once the configuration is correctly set in the GUI, you can run it and it will give you the response back, and it has all the internal connectors to do that different capabilities. So to start with the Visual Studio side of things, so firstly what I'll do is I'll quickly run this experience on the Azure function side. So if I run this, it should be pretty quick. But in the meanwhile, while that build and run is happening, I'll just quickly show you how simple it is to access your Microsoft Graph API using any of the coding platforms, whether it's a .NET or it's different other technologies like Java or JavaScript framework based technologies. So if you look at it, let me just create some space. Yep. So if you look at it, I have a simple function. What that function does is I just get a user. So obviously I'm making a request, and once I make the request, I'll get a user back. So what that means is, if I just, again, for reference, the first stage of the function app will be that it'll go and make a request to get a token. And the second stage is where we will make a request for a downstream product to get some details, and we will align the token along with that particular request. So now coming back to our code. So over here, as you can see, what I have is I have a function where all the magic is happening. So a simple side of things is all this is .NET, but there are equivalent stuff in Java as well as SPS. So I have a confidential client application which I have set up, which is more about managing the ident, like getting access to the token and whatnot from the Azure AD. Now at this point, this is where we acquire a token. And what we need to provide as a detail is you provide your client ID. If you remember when I was showing you the Azure Portal experience, the client ID is crucial. So you provide your client ID and then also your client secret. So that's your client ID and that's your client secret. And then it basically, without giving a user experience model where you have a pop-up and you select a particular account, this will be more like a service account experience. So everything will be running under the hood, and all the security, the client security will be able to help Azure AD to validate the particular client ID and give a response back. So once that is done and you get a result which is more about your token, and we will basically extract and look into the token itself as well. So once you have the token extracted out, the next stage is that's where we are trying to call the API. So if I go back to the diagram, so now what I'm going to explain you on the code side will be this part of the story where we are going into stage 3 and stage 4. So if we go into the 3 and 4, what we are doing is we are just creating a request to this particular endpoint, and then also we have an API URL. So if I go into the configuration file, so that's my configuration file, and that's my base, so graph.microsoft.com, if you remember. So that's the same base URL which will come over here, and then I'll make a request to the version 1 and get the user details. So that's it. And this is just an extension function which I have written in a separate class. What it does is it attaches the token to the bearer and then builds your HTTP request header and whatnot. And then once the request, before sending the request, all that bells and whistles are all set over here in this particular code, and then that request is made to Azure AD, and once the request is successful, we get a reply back, which is the specific user we should get over here. So this is the first part of the demo, and the good part is we have our application running. So if I now go back into the browser, and what I'll do is I'll just quickly run the request for this endpoint. So let me quickly show you that. So just give me a second. So this is all good. So if I just change to my browser, all right, so okay, at this stage we do not have anything, and I'll just put the request over here. So once I make a request, basically there will be a couple of things happening, and I'll switch screens. So maybe I'll, once I make the request, okay, so let me just grab the URL from the, okay, I've just add S instead of R. So if I click on that, so that request is now initiated. And let's jump into the code side of things. So once we are in the code, all right, so yeah, so it's basically making a request to the Azure AD. And once the request is successful, we should get a result back. And once the, obviously the result is like the token is received, that's where the next stage will happen, which is more about making a request to the Azure AD, getting all the users from the Azure AD. So let me just quickly see what's happening. All right, so let's just quickly restart this. So all right, so now since our Azure function is running, so we'll just copy the URL of our Azure function, this one. and we will just check it into a browser. So let me bring a browser over here, and I'll just put the URL. So as we have just punched in a URL. All right, so our Azure function has been triggered, and okay, we have a couple of things which have already happened. So the token has been acquired because that stage is already done, and we also have a token coming in. So we have an authorization result which has been received. Now, before we jump into making a request to the user, I would like to basically look at what the token is. So let me put a breakpoint over here, because here we can get the token in a string format. And what I'll do is I'll quickly do a F5. So now that request should come over here. And if I go and open the token, I'll just quickly open the token. That's my token. And yeah, so I'll just show you the details of the token. And like before we do that, I'll just quickly run this so that we get a reply back of the request which we have made. So at this stage, it's still running. And what I do is I'll just quickly run this. So yeah, so this request is all completed now. Yep, so no errors. And if I go into the web page, so, okay, now as you can see, I have got all the users from my Azure AD tenant. Now, where exactly are these users coming from? So I'll quickly show you the Azure portal. And if I go inside my users, so if I come over here and I just make it a bit on the right side. All right, so you can see quite a number of users. So we have that's my AD tenant, akglobal.onmicrosoft.com, and that's akglobal on microsoft.com. So I have my asif.khan, which is coming in. I have Khan Asif on Gmail, which should be somewhere here. Yeah, that's the Khan Asif on Gmail, and obviously all the other users. So we have Peter at akglobal.com. So that's Peter at akglobal.com. So these are all relevant users coming from my Azure AD tenant. So that's perfect. Now coming back to our JWT token which we got. So let's extract that token and see what it looks like. So I'll just quickly come over here. So this is the token we extracted, and let me just Control V. So yeah, that's the token. So if you look at the token at this stage, there are quite a number of things, but the most interesting one is this user.readAll. So what we are saying is this is where we give this particular request token, the token reply which we have got from AD. It says that you are authorized as a role to access the users and read them only, not write them, not change them. So that's one part. Now, if you want to see, and this is a very good website, so jwt.ms, go to it, put your claim token, whichever you get, whatever you get from Azure AD, and it will do extract everything out of that. Now, obviously, it's very hard to understand what these all acronyms mean. So if you can put a full claim, it will give you full details of what exactly are those details. So things like this is your expiry time. So it's going to expire on 30th September and in the GMT plus 10, which is Australian time zone at 1:47. So current time is 12:51. It's almost like 45 minutes or so. So apart from that, obviously it also gives you that's the application name which we have registered in Azure AD. It also gives you things like your different IDs, even the request ID. So all that is pretty much available over here, and you can basically come and investigate those token components and whatnot, which you're getting back from Azure AD. So yeah, so that's done. I think that's the first part of our demo. Now the second bit is more about if we just continue with the Azure function because it's already running. The second part is where we are trying to get the OneDrive files and stuff. So before we go there, let me quickly show you what I have in my OneDrive at this stage. So if I open my OneDrive and switch screens, not this one. Yep. So this is my OneDrive, and obviously it's available inside my Microsoft 365 subscription. I have a My folder in that OneDrive, and inside that My folder, I have just one file inside that. So that's nothing fancy happening over here. And if I just quickly show you the Graph API. So again, this is a different subscription. So I have another app registration which I have done. So it's just another tenant where I have done the second app registration. The reason for doing all this was because my previous tenant which I was using, and so I didn't had Microsoft 365 license over there, so I can't use OneDrive to access resources. That's why I had to set up a separate environment with a different tenant, and then I have Microsoft 365 enabled on this tenant users. So now using that, I can access my OneNote and Outlook and all that stuff. So it's a simple app registration MS Graph app. And then on top of it, what I have is if I go inside the permissions, which is the interesting bit. So as you can see over here, I have file read all, user read. Now let's go into the Azure function and see that endpoint. So as you can see, I have another endpoint over here, which is my OneDrive endpoint. So if I quickly run that and copy that, and I'll just run it in a browser so that we have an easy experience. So that's OneDrive. Okay, yeah, so the OneDrive experience is pretty interesting. So before we go there, I'll quickly show you something else as well. So in this, what I've tried to do is I'll try to show you an experience where obviously the API over here, if you look at the code, this is my OneDrive code. What it is doing is just going and accessing the OneDrive, all the child folders and stuff, but it doesn't have anything related to how will it do the stage 1 and 2 in our previous diagram. So that's where I'm already sending a token over here. The reason for doing this is obviously in production, you won't be doing such examples just for the explanation purposes. So what that means is if I switch into my browser and let me open the browser. So what I have over here is I have a URL which I have created, and I'll show you what that URL looks like. So this is the URL which you are seeing on the screen. So it is login.microsoft.com. I have basically provided a client ID. Now this client ID is the MS Graph app ID which we have. So if I just show you no smoking mirror, so if F29E, let's go into the Microsoft, sorry, Graph APIs. So that's the Microsoft Graph API, and let's see the client ID what we have. So it's F29E. That's the same client ID we are referring. And apart from that, I've just provided explicit scope. You can also like provide .default over here, which will take the scope which we have already set in the Azure AD app registration. And then we also provide what is the redirect URL. So I've just set random localhost. I don't have anything, but yeah, in the browser, I'll see a localhost, and then along to that, I'll see the token access token as well. So now if I come over here and if I just say, okay, this is my tenant user, which is my on Microsoft Scout on Microsoft.com. So if I just quickly show you that, so this is my, okay, I've just hidden it, but yeah, if you can see, it's Kanativ1 at Microsoft Scout on Microsoft.com. So if I just quickly log in with that, so once it is logged in, it will reply back with localhost. And yeah, so yep, so as you can see, localhost, and that's my access token. So if I select that, it's a pretty long one, and it also brings in a couple of other things. So let me just select everything and show you on a notepad. So if I put it over here, so we get the access token, which is one part of the query string, and then we get a couple of other things. So you can see over here we are getting a scope. This is the scope we have set in our setup process for the application. We get something around the session state, and then also we get things around the token and whatnot. So that's, so hopefully this is my token which I'm getting back. And if I just copy that and put it into Jot, so if I click over here and I put it, so as you can see over here, I have it like it's already just extracted out all the stuff. And yeah, so it is pretty straightforward, giving us all the details of whatever is replied back by by the particular Azure AD. So it's a valid token as well. Now, if I take the same token And yeah, so I'll just take the token, and this is where we will do something interesting. So we will call the OneDrive endpoint, and what I'll do is I'll just put it on the same screen as where our code is running. So let me just go on the code screen, and yep, so I'll just open the browser over here. So what I have is I need to provide a token as a part of my URL. Obviously, when you do in production, you will not do it like this. You will be having a post request or something. So if I click this, that should come in, and if I run this, so I've got the token over here. So that's my token. Next, it will go and extract the particular OneDrive um, elements out. Yep. And if I just hover this, you can see I've got a reply back. And if I run this uh, in the browser itself, I should get a reply. So now if you can see, what I have is I have my folder, which is this one. And let me just quickly show you on the OneDrive itself. So this is my OneDrive folder, my folder, um, and that's what it has provided me back, and it said there's only one child count. Now, obviously, just to prove that there are no smoking mirrors, I'll just quickly create another folder. I'll create demo folder, and I'll just say create. So now it's created a demo folder. I'll run the same request again. It'll go back, get the details, and yeah, if I run that, yep. So now you can see I have a demo folder, and I also have my folder. So I have got both the folders coming out of the OneDrive. So that is pretty much it from the function side of things. Now let's say if we want to have a similar sort of experience with a MSAL library, which is Microsoft Authentication library, and with let's say the Graph SDK instead of HTTP based requests which we are making. So let's just quickly close that. And as you can see over here, what I have is I have a couple of things. I have used a NuGet package. Again, if you're using other technologies like Java or you're using SPAs, obviously you will get a similar sort of experience. There are different libraries over there. So we are using Microsoft Identity Client, which is more for the authentication purposes. Graph API library will help us in accessing all the different Graph API underlying downstream systems. So if this is, so just quickly run through. So if you can see over here, this is my Graph API client, and then I have some configuration details, which is coming from my config file. And once that, this is a get authentication, which is a function which is over here. What it does is it just goes and does all the things which we did using the HTTP based model. Now it is all abstracted out in a .NET class. If it is a Java, it will be Java class, or it's Node, it will be having its own relevant libraries. So it gets all the relevant details and builds a request, and then using the MSAL authentication provider, it gets a token back. Now, once it gets the token back, it provides, so once this request is completed, it replies back a MSAL token. That authorization provider is what the MSAL um, token is, and then it sets a graph client, which is the client we will use to access a user, which you can use to access let's say other capabilities as well, which is OneDrive or all the resources we have been talking since the beginning. And that's the reply which goes into the graph client, and then we use the graph client to access the user using the async model. So that's a simple execution using the graph, no HTTP, pretty much very native .NET code. So I'll just set it as a startup project. Yeah, so everything is very native, SDKs and MSAL library for all the authentication purposes and whatnot. We will be getting the same set of users which we saw when we did run the HTTP endpoint. But yeah, it is just a different way how you can access the Microsoft Graph API using a .NET Client library, SDK library of Graph API as well as MSAL. So yeah, it should be pretty quick. Yeah, still running. So the thing which I'm trying to alluding towards is Microsoft Graph is a very unified platform, irrespective to the technology, irrespective to how you are building your stack, you can use Microsoft Graph. So at this stage, as you can see, I have that again, same user asif.khan at AK Global, and then we also have Peter at global.onmicrosoft.com. So we are accessing it using MSAL and using Microsoft Graph SDK. So if I just quickly close this, so that's pretty much it when what we want to do from the .NET code side. Quickly run you through if you want to do it through Postman. Again, two-stage processes. I've just tried to split that. So first stage is I'm making a request using the token endpoint of Azure AD. So I've already populated all my details about the client secret. As I said, there are different ways. You can have a user experience-based model, which we saw on the browser. You go and select a user, you get a token back in the URL itself. If you remember, we had that local host and access token. That was one way with a very intuitive user experience model. But let's say if you're running a daemon job or something in the background, then you can use a client secret model as well. So in this is a client secret. I run this, I'll get a token back. Yeah, so I've got a token back. Now this token, if I just pull this token and I copy this, and if I take it to my user endpoint, so graph.microsoft.com, v1 and user, the same endpoint which we used in the .NET code for HTTP, I'll just update the token. And if I run this, I should get the similar response of users. So I have again the same user, asif.khan at akglobal.com, and then I should also have Peter somewhere in this. So if I scroll down, yep, so Peter Gray, Peter at akglobal.com. Again, you can use that similar model for graph for like OneDrives, and you can use for other aspects as well. So you can access all of that using the Postman as well. So if I go into the OneDrive for using the OneDrive model, again, we might have to get the token which we got earlier. So I'll just copy the token from the browser. Yeah, so that's our browser. I'll just copy the token from here. I think once we chuck that in to our into our token over here, it should be able to get the OneDrive details which we are after. So yeah, it's getting the root details. If I want to get the exact thing which we saw on the Azure function side of things on the web page. So if I just quickly run this, yeah, so it gives me my demo folder, and it also gives me my folder. So both the folders are here. So this is more about using the Postman natively if you want to do that. I think the last bit which you are left with is using something like a low code, no code. And this is pretty easy compared to all the other things which I've shown you of till now. So if you look at this, it is simple logic apps, HTTP trigger. And then inside the HTTP, what I'm doing is request is a HTTP request. I'm again using the same user option. And then I provided things like tenant, client, and secret. Again, everything is a background process, so we do not get a user pop-up experience over here, which will not be a valid model to execute. So it will be running behind the screen, but yeah, it'll be using our security token which we have set up in the Azure AD. And I'll just quickly show you that uh, security key which we have set up. So if I go into my Microsoft Graph, if you go inside the certificates and secrets, that's where you can create, and if you can create a new secret, it's pretty simple. Just describe, put a name, and it has different options. You can also have a custom range for the expiry. The expiry is important because obviously you don't want a password or a secret which should exist forever. There are different ways, much better ways to do this. Instead of just putting over here, you can also put it into your key vault for making it more secure and then access it from the key vault, irrespective to whether it's through Azure function or let's say through a logic apps or whatever it is. Now I'll quickly run this, which will basically get the same set of users. It's again very quick on an experience side. Yeah, as you can see, it ran for less than like 0 seconds. It's unable to do a microsecond count. But yeah, that's where we have got the 200 response. Everything was successful, and if I see raw output, I can come over here and I'll see all my users. So yeah, as you can see over here, I have got my users. So I have AK Asif.Khan at AK Global, and then also I should have Peter somewhere in this. Yeah, so that's Peter, aka global.onmicrosoft.com. So I have shown you a couple of examples how you can leverage Microsoft Graph. 100%, it's a very powerful tool. The level of downstream system it connects to, it's enormous. It can help you in building wide variety of solutions and products, which can help your business as well as help you in improving your overall experience. I think the best place where I look this is something like if you're doing if you're Azure AD admin or something like that, you can build your entire sync process, your own custom syncing process and whatnot, or even user management can be made very easy through the API experience which you're seeing over here. So yeah, so in like to conclude, I would say I would highly recommend to get the experience, try to set it up. It's very easy. First thing, you just need to set up a simple Azure AD app registration. So once you have that Azure AD app registration done, I think everything after that is very straightforward. So just I'll quickly run down what I just said. So if you look at this, the first thing is you come and do an app registration, provide, once you have the app registration, the next stage is where you just set the API permissions, relevant API permissions for all the downstream resources you want to access. Stage three, if you want to run it as a daemon or a background job, you basically create a secret and whatnot, and that's it. That's it, what you're done with the setup of this. And then there are native code libraries in GitHub and which is at the Microsoft GitHub repository where you can get a lot of samples without even writing a code. You can experience Microsoft Graph, and some of the sample links are available in the link down below. All the code which I've shown you is also available in my GitHub, and I have the link in the description section of this video. So hopefully this session was helpful, and it was, and hopefully you will go and do a first-hand experience with Graph API. Thanks a lot for watching.